It was supposed to be the happiest day of her young life. June 13th, 2009, a humid Saturday afternoon in Maple Hollow, Tennessee. The kind of small southern town where neighbors knew each other's kids by name, and birthday parties spilled out from backyards into open driveways. 8-year-old Lila Hartley had been counting down to that day for weeks. Pink balloons tied to the fence fluttered in the mild summer breeze, a barbecue grill hissed and smoked, and the sound of children's laughter carried down the quiet suburban street. In photographs taken that day, the ones police would later study frame by frame, Lila stood in the center of the celebration, a small girl with light brown hair, freckles dusted across her cheeks, and a pink cotton dress that matched the frosting on her cake. Her mother, Dana, had ordered the cake from a local bakery. It was already beginning to sag in the heat by the time the candles were lit. Neighbors remember how Lila squinted from the sun as she made her wish. Someone had said, jokingly, "Don't tell anyone what it is or it won't come true." By 4 p.m., the sound of music and laughter still filled the yard, adults chatting near the grill, kids darting between a sprinkler and a swing set. Nothing seemed out of place. But somewhere between the games and the cleanup, between a spilled drink and a missing balloon, Lila Hartley disappeared. No one realized it at first. Parties like that had a natural kind of chaos. Kids moving between backyards, parents distracted with small talk. When Dana called the children together to open presents, Lila wasn't among them. Her friends assumed she'd gone inside for a drink or was in the front yard. A neighbor offered to check the bathroom. Someone else checked the side yard, expecting to see her sitting by the fence, chasing a butterfly like she always did. Within 10 minutes, that faint sense of confusion began to shift into something heavier, that slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. Dana called her name once, twice, then again, louder. The chatter in the yard faded. The sound of the wind chimes and the hum of cicadas filled the silence. Guests began walking in widening circles, calling, "Lila," down the sidewalk, their voices rising in pitch and urgency. By 4:30, Dana was trembling as she ran through the house, opening every door, checking closets, the garage, even the washer and dryer, as if she might find her little girl crouched somewhere giggling, hiding as part of a game that had gone too far. But Lila wasn't there. When the first patrol car arrived just after 5 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The street was now lined with anxious neighbors, parents holding their children close. One officer began questioning guests while another moved through the yard, calling for quiet so the search dogs could begin. The dogs circled near the patio, sniffed Lila's shoes from inside the house, and moved toward the back fence, a 6-foot cedar barrier that bordered the Cole family's property. Then, just beyond it, they stopped. The scent trail ended abruptly. That was the first thing detectives noted as unusual. Even if a child had wandered off, the dogs should have been able to follow her trail at least a few hundred yards toward the road, into a nearby lot, or into the woods behind the subdivision. But it was as if Lila had vanished in midair. By nightfall, Maple Hollow was swarming with volunteers. Flashlights cut through the dark as groups spread across lawns and wooded patches, calling her name. Helicopters from the county sheriff's office hovered overhead. Reporters gathered near the cul-de-sac entrance, broadcasting live updates. Within 12 hours, the story had reached every home in the state. 8-year-old girl missing from birthday party in Maple Hollow. Inside the Hartley home, detectives interviewed family members separately. Lila's father, Tom, sat, rigid in the kitchen, face pale, answering the same questions over and over: who was at the party, what time she was last seen, whether anyone had recently moved into the neighborhood. He said everyone there was family or close friends. Everyone except one man, the neighbor across the street, Richard Cole, who had stopped by that morning to help set up tables and drop off an extra cooler of ice. Cole lived alone. He'd been around for years, mostly kept to himself. At that point, no one suspected him of anything. He had chatted with guests, smiled for a few photos, and then left before lunch. Still, detectives made a note of his name. By dawn the next morning, search teams had combed through every inch of Maple Hollow. They drained a nearby retention pond, swept ditches, crawled through culverts. Not a single trace, no footprints, no fibers, no clothing, no blood. That Sunday, the Hartleys stood on their front lawn surrounded by cameras. Dana pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. her voice cracking, the exhaustion and disbelief written across her face. Behind her, the pink decorations from the party were still hanging, faded, swaying in the humid wind. As the hours turned into days, the investigation grew larger. Police checked every registered vehicle that had passed the neighborhood that afternoon. They pulled surveillance footage from local stores, gas stations, traffic lights. Hundreds of tips flooded in supposed sightings, theories, leads that went nowhere. Each day, the search radius widened, but the results were the same. Nothing. The longer Lila was gone, the more desperate the town became. Flyers with her school photo taken just weeks before covered telephone poles, grocery store windows, and car windshields. Churches held prayer vigils. Strangers left stuffed animals at the base of the Hartley's mailbox. Meanwhile, detectives began to question how a child could disappear in broad daylight from a yard full of people. They reviewed photographs and home videos from the party frame by frame, studying the background faces, shadows, even reflections in car windows. They noted one detail. In the last known photo of Lila, taken just minutes before she vanished, she was standing near the back fence, her balloon string wrapped around her wrist, looking upward. It was a still moment, frozen in time, one that investigators would later revisit again and again. That night, as the second day drew to a close, search crews were pulled back. The chief investigator addressed the media, his words heavy. At this time, we are treating this as both a missing person case and a potential abduction. Behind those words lay a silent admission they no longer believed Lila had simply wandered off. In the following days, Maple Hollow transformed into something else entirely, a community gripped by fear and suspicion. Parents walked their kids to school instead of letting them ride the bus. Neighbors locked their doors before sunset. The quiet cul-de-sac where Lila had lived was now lined with police tape and satellite trucks. Detectives worked around the clock, but every promising lead dissolved. Witness statements contradicted each other. Timelines overlapped. One neighbor claimed to have seen a white van near the corner that afternoon, but traffic cameras found no record of it. Another insisted she heard crying near the woods around sunset, but search dogs found nothing there either. By the end of the first week, hope was thinning. Detectives began to re-interview guests, looking for inconsistencies, anything that might have been overlooked. One investigator later recalled how, during those interviews, there was one person who seemed strangely detached, polite, cooperative, but calm to a degree that didn't fit the chaos around him. It was Richard Cole, the neighbor across the street. At the time, no one pushed too hard. He wasn't on record as the last person to see Lila, and there was no physical evidence tying him to the disappearance. Still, his name remained in the case notes, circled in pencil. As weeks turned into months, the media frenzy slowly ebbed. Other stories replaced Lila's in the headlines, but in Maple Hollow, the absence lingered. Dana Hartley stopped sleeping in her own bedroom, too haunted by the sight of the backyard. Tom returned to work, but co-workers said he was barely there in spirit. The balloons, long deflated, were still tied to the fence post until the wind tore them away. For a town like Maple Hollow, the disappearance of a child wasn't just a crime, it was a wound that refused to heal. And for the Hartleys, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across 15 long years. Because what no one could have known then, not the detectives, not the reporters, not even Dana herself, was that the answer to what happened to her daughter wasn't buried in the woods or hidden by a stranger, miles away. It was waiting right there in the same neighborhood, just across the street. In the days that followed Lila Hartley's disappearance, Maple Hollow felt like it had stopped breathing. Patrol cars still lined the street, officers combed through brush along the creek, and neighbors gathered on porches whispering theories to one another. The Hartleys' backyard, once filled with laughter, balloons, and the sound of children's games, had become a taped-off crime scene. Every blade of grass photographed, every footprint measured. Detectives from the county's Missing Persons Division worked methodically. They began by interviewing every guest who had attended the party. Parents, children, relatives, each was questioned multiple times. Their statements compared and cross-referenced. Timelines were reconstructed minute by minute. Detectives logged vehicle plates from security cameras at the main road leading into the subdivision. Nothing stood out. No one had seen a struggle, a strange car, or anyone leaving in a hurry. It was as if Lila had simply ceased to exist somewhere between her backyard and the fence line. Attention eventually turned to the house across the street, the home of Richard Cole, a 42-year-old maintenance worker who lived alone after a recent divorce. He had been friendly with the Hartleys, occasionally helping Dana with yard work or bringing their trash cans in on pickup days. He was there that morning, offering to help set up the folding chairs before the party began. But several witnesses remembered seeing him leave around noon, and he insisted he'd spent the rest of the afternoon running errands and watching TV. Detectives asked to see his car, a beige sedan with aging tires and a cracked windshield. They dusted it for prints, ran cadaver dogs around the perimeter, checked his garage and basement. Nothing incriminating turned up. He seemed nervous, but then again, most people were when police came knocking. His alibi wasn't perfect, but it wasn't wrong either. Surveillance from a gas station down the road showed him buying cigarettes around the time the party ended. Still, something about him lingered in the back of investigators' minds, too calm, too cooperative, his tone detached as though the gravity of the situation hadn't really sunk in. But without physical evidence, suspicion could only go so far. The focus shifted again, this time inward to the family. Statistically, investigators knew that in cases involving missing children, the perpetrator was often someone within the household. They began dissecting the Hartleys' marriage, their finances, their phone records. The once sympathetic police presence became invasive. Detectives questioned why Dana had waited nearly 15 minutes before calling 911. They scrutinized her tone during the interview, her gestures, her tears. To them, grief could sometimes mask guilt. Tom, the father, became the next target of quiet speculation. He had been outside at the grill when Lila disappeared, talking with a neighbor about car repairs. But there were inconsistencies in his timeline too, moments when no one could confirm where he was. He grew defensive, angry at repeated questioning. "You think I'd hurt my daughter?" he reportedly told one detective. But frustration only fueled the rumors. As days turned to weeks, the story began to splinter under the weight of media coverage. Local reporters ran nightly updates, their headlines becoming more dramatic with each passing day. "Family secrets in Maple Hollow," one read. Another tabloid suggested a custody plot gone wrong. Television trucks parked along the street. Strangers walked by the house taking photos. Dana stopped leaving the house altogether. Theories multiplied. Some believed a traveling predator had passed through town and spotted an opportunity. Others whispered about a relative with a criminal record. A few clung to the idea that Lila had been taken by someone she knew and might still be alive somewhere, kept hidden. But every lead turned into another dead end. The toll on the Hartley family was devastating. The public scrutiny became unbearable. Online forums dissected their interviews, their facial expressions, even the clothes they wore at press conferences. When a national talk show host implied that a mother always knows, Dana collapsed on her kitchen floor, sobbing. Tom's anger hardened into silence. He stopped cooperating with police after they executed a search warrant on his truck. Their marriage, already strained by sleepless nights and the constant hum of suspicion, began to fracture. The house itself changed too. The backyard, once green and lively, grew overgrown with weeds. The pink swing set was dismantled and stored in the garage. Lila's bedroom stayed untouched, her favorite stuffed rabbit still perched on the pillow. But the laughter that once filled those walls was gone. In its place was only the echo of questions no one could answer. By the end of that summer, the media's interest began to fade. The story that had dominated headlines was slowly replaced by newer tragedies. Candlelight vigils turned smaller, attendance dwindling as weeks stretched into months. Dana still attended each one, clutching the same photo of Lila in her pink dress, her expression hollow. In the police department, the case file had grown thick, hundreds of pages of interviews, search warrants, and photographs. Detectives argued over theories late into the night. One believed Lila had been accidentally killed and her body hidden nearby. Another thought she'd been abducted by a stranger who fled the state. But without evidence, no remains, no witnesses, no forensic trail, there was little more they could do. The investigation slowly lost funding, manpower, and momentum. By spring of the following year, the Maple Hollow birthday disappearance was officially labeled a cold case. It was placed in a metal filing cabinet in the basement of the county sheriff's office, one folder among hundreds of others, marked with missing faces and faded names. For the Hartleys, life splintered permanently. Dana moved in with her sister for a time, unable to bear the silence of the house. Tom sold his business and left town altogether. They rarely spoke. What had once been a family bound by love was now bound only by grief and unanswered questions. Yet for those who still lived on that street, the neighbors who'd watched the chaos unfold, there was a sense that something had been missed. Something obvious, hidden in plain sight. Richard Cole still lived across the street. His lawn was immaculate, his curtains always drawn. He occasionally waved when he saw someone he recognized, but people no longer waved back. The man who had once helped hang birthday streamers was now treated like a ghost, among the living quietly avoided, politely feared. Behind closed doors, residents whispered. They couldn't prove it, but many believed the truth had been right there all along, sealed behind one of those neat white walls across the street. And for years, that quiet unease, half suspicion, half denial would settle over Maple Hollow like a fog that refused to lift. No one knew it then, but 15 years later, that fog was about to break. 15 years passed, but in Maple Hollow, time never really moved forward. The cul-de-sac, where the Hartleys once lived, remained eerily unchanged, as if the day of Lila's birthday had been caught in amber. The same oak tree stood by the sidewalk, its bark carved with initials long since forgotten. The same quiet houses lined the street, though most of the families who had once filled them with laughter were gone. New residents came and went, drawn by the low property prices but unaware of the shadow the neighborhood carried. Locals still lowered their voices when mentioning the birthday party house. By 2024, Maple Hollow had become a place people passed through, not a place they stayed. The few who'd lived there long enough to remember that summer of 2009 described it like a wound that never closed, not bleeding anymore, but never quite healed either. The Hartley home had changed hands 3 times. Each family repainted the walls, remodeled the kitchen, replaced the back fence. But beneath it all, something unspoken lingered. People claimed they felt uneasy there, though no one could explain why. Across the years, Dana Hartley tried to rebuild what life would allow. The first few years were the hardest. Her mornings began with the same ache, that moment between sleep and waking when she'd still expect to hear Lila's footsteps in the hallway. When reality set in, she'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed school photo on her dresser, her daughter's smile frozen in innocence. Eventually, Dana found purpose in the pain. She began volunteering for missing children organizations, at first quietly, then publicly. By 2018, she was traveling across Tennessee to speak at community centers, churches, and schools. She told her story not as a plea for sympathy but as a warning that something like this could happen anywhere, to anyone. She spoke with the steady calm of someone who had made peace with uncertainty, but those closest to her knew she hadn't. Every year, on June 13th, she returned to Maple Hollow. She parked her car on the same street, walked to the fence line where the search dogs had last picked up Lila's scent, and tied a bundle of pink balloons to the post. Neighbors who still remembered her would come out to watch from their porches, unsure whether to approach. Dana never stayed long. She would stand there for a few minutes, whisper something no one could hear, then drive away. Elsewhere, Detective Marianne Lowell had retired years ago, though the word retired never fit her well. She had been the lead investigator on Lila's case, sharp, methodical, and relentless, but time had worn her down in ways no one could see. The case had haunted her more than any she'd ever worked. She kept the original file in her home office, a thick binder of reports, statements, and photos. She'd told herself she held on to it because one day there might be a break, a new lead. But in truth, she couldn't let go because it had become part of her. The file sat on her desk like a scar she couldn't stop tracing. Some nights, she would pour a glass of bourbon, open the folder, and study the same details she'd memorized years ago, the timestamps, the maps, the photo of the fence line where the scent stopped. She still wondered what they'd missed. She'd gone back to that neighborhood more times than she could count, walking the route herself, imagining what an 8-year-old might have seen, might have heard. Every time she left, she felt the same chill of defeat. The town's younger residents barely remembered the story. To them, it was something their parents mentioned when warning them to stay close to home. The phrase, "that birthday girl," had become almost mythic, an echo of tragedy more than a memory of a real child. The few remaining neighbors avoided discussing it at all. For them, forgetting was a kind of survival. Then, one night in the spring of 2024, Maple Hollow stirred again. Just after midnight, the County 911 Dispatch Center received a call from a nursing home on the outskirts of town. The line was faint, the voice trembling and low, almost a whisper. The caller identified himself as Richard Cole, age 72, the same man who had once lived across the street from the Hartleys. The operator asked him what the emergency was. His answer was nearly swallowed by the sound of oxygen, hiss, and static. "I can't carry it anymore," he said. "I know what happened to that birthday girl." The dispatcher froze. The phrase was unmistakable. That birthday girl. It was the same one used by locals when they spoke of the case, the same one the media had used 15 years ago. When the operator asked him to repeat it, his voice broke. "The little girl, the one from Maple Hollow. I need to tell someone before I go." Then the line went dead. Within an hour, officers were dispatched to the nursing home. They found Richard Cole sitting upright in his bed, trembling. His eyes were red, his breathing shallow. When they asked what he meant, he told them he'd been seeing her face for months in his sleep, in the hallway reflections, even in the window glass. He said it wasn't right to keep it inside any longer. The attending nurse told detectives he'd been growing increasingly agitated over the past week. He'd refused medication, claiming he didn't want to die with lies in his lungs. His medical records showed advanced lung disease. Doctors didn't expect him to live much longer. When word of the contoured call reached Detective Lowell the next morning, she sat motionless for several minutes before speaking. She was 70 now, slower, fragile, but her mind was still sharp. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Richard Cole, the man she'd quietly suspected but could never prove guilty, had finally said something that sounded like a confession. She drove to the precinct, her old badge hanging from the rearview mirror, the case file sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She hadn't been there in years, but walking through those doors felt like stepping back into the heat of that summer in 2009. At the same time, Dana Hartley was at home in Nashville when her phone began ringing nonstop. The first call came from a local reporter, the second from an old friend in Maple Hollow, the third from a detective she hadn't heard from in over a decade. All of them said the same thing. A man had come forward claiming to know what happened to Lila. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the edge of her bed, her hand gripping the phone, the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. For 15 years, Dana had imagined this moment countless times: a phone call, a lead, a confession. In her mind, she'd prepared herself for it. But when it finally came, she realized there was no way to prepare for hope returning after so long buried. That night, Maple Hollow was no longer silent. News vans rolled back down the old cul-de-sac, headlights sweeping over the cracked pavement, illuminating a neighborhood that thought it had escaped its ghosts. Reporters gathered near the fence where the balloons used to be, where the trail had ended. And inside a dim hospital room across town, a frail old man whispered the words that would shatter 15 years of quiet and reopen a wound that never healed. "I didn't mean for it to happen." It was the first time anyone had heard the truth spoken out loud, but it wouldn't be the last. Every case here takes weeks of digging, verifying, and piecing together real lives that were lost. These stories matter. Someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. Watch more solved cold cases in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. When detectives entered Richard Cole's room at the Maple Hollow Care Center, the first thing they noticed was the sound, the faint, rhythmic hiss of oxygen pushing through a clear plastic tube. The room smelled of antiseptic and old air. Richard sat propped up against his pillows, a thin blanket pulled to his chest, his breathing shallow but steady. His hands trembled as he reached for the cup of water on his bedside table, the IV line on his wrist twitching with each movement. He looked nothing like the man they remembered from the old case photos, the neighbor who once helped hang balloons for a little girl's birthday party. Time had stripped him of that image, leaving only a fragile shell. Detectives Marianne Lowell and James Klein stood at the edge of the room, unsure how to begin. It wasn't often that a man called 911 to confess to one of the most haunting unsolved cases in the county's history. They had replayed his words over and over before coming. "I can't carry it anymore. I know what happened to that birthday girl." Lowell took a step closer. Richard's eyes were sunken but alert, scanning their faces with a strange mix of relief and dread. When he finally spoke, his voice rasped like sandpaper. "I don't have long," he said. "I just want to leave clean." He told them that on the day of Lila Hartley's 8th birthday, he'd been sitting on his porch when he saw her chasing a balloon that had slipped free from the party. It drifted across the yard and over his fence, bouncing gently in the summer breeze. He called out to her, told her he'd help her find it. According to him, she followed him into his garage, trusting him the way children trusted familiar adults. He said he remembered turning his back for a second, just a second, to look for the balloon, and when he turned around, she was on the floor. She wasn't moving. He claimed she'd fallen and hit her head on a metal tool near his workbench. His hands trembled as he tried to demonstrate, tracing an invisible spot on his temple. His voice cracked as he described kneeling beside her, shaking her shoulder, calling her name. He said there was blood, not much, but enough to know something was terribly wrong. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he kept saying. "It was an accident." The detectives didn't interrupt. They just listened, their notepads untouched. After 15 years of silence, the story they had been chasing was spilling out in fragments, confused, hesitant, but terrifyingly plausible. Richard told them he panicked. He didn't call 911. Instead, he said he wrapped Lila's body in an old tarp from his shed, waited until dark, and took her to the creek. His breathing quickened as he said it, the words collapsing into each other. He said he carried her in the trunk of his car, parked near the old service road by the woods, and left her by the water, weighted with rocks. He said he couldn't remember exactly where, just somewhere near the bend where the creek split into two narrow channels. When Lowell asked why he'd never spoken up, his answer was barely audible. "Because I told myself it wasn't my fault," he whispered. "But she's been in my dreams ever since. I see her every night standing by that fence, holding that pink balloon." He began to cry deep, shaking sobs that sent his oxygen mask sliding down his face. The detectives exchanged a glance. They had heard false confessions before, but something in his trembling detail, the way he remembered the smallest things, the color of the balloon, the sound of her sandals on the pavement, made it feel disturbingly real. They left the room just after sunrise, the recording device still running in Lowell's coat pocket. By the time they stepped into the morning light, both detectives were quiet, the weight of the confession pressing down on them. Within hours, search teams were mobilized. County deputies, forensic technicians, and divers spread out along the creek Richard had described. It was the same creek that wound behind the old service road, about 2 miles from Maple Hollow. The terrain was overgrown, thick with brush and vines. Excavators began digging in the areas marked on the map. Richard drew shakily from his bed, but nothing appeared. No tarp, no clothing, no bones. For 2 days, teams scoured the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in, but their alerts were inconsistent. Rain from earlier in the week had turned the ground to mud, erasing whatever trace might have once existed. On the 3rd day, the search was suspended. The sheriff stood before reporters and said they were working to corroborate the suspect's statements. Behind the calm tone, frustration was setting in. If Richard Cole was telling the truth, they had no evidence to prove it. And if he was lying, the question was why. When Lowell and Klein returned to the nursing home for a follow-up interview, Richard's condition had worsened. His voice was thinner now, his words harder to catch. He said he wanted to make it right, but when they pressed for more specifics, landmarks, details, anything, his answers shifted. One minute he insisted it was near the bridge. The next he swore it was by the trailhead. He mentioned a second person at one point, his brother, long deceased, but then denied it moments later. The story began to unravel. Lowell left the room with her stomach in knots. After 15 years, she had finally heard the words she'd been waiting for, but now she wasn't sure they meant anything at all. She'd spent her career chasing truth, and here, on the verge of finding it, the truth itself was slipping through her fingers. News of the confession spread fast. By the following evening, the story was everywhere again. Neighbor confesses in Maple Hollow disappearance. The small Tennessee town that had learned to live in silence was suddenly thrown back into the spotlight. Old wounds reopened. Talk shows debated whether the confession was credible. Some residents claimed they had always known it was him. Others said it didn't make sense that no one could keep something like that hidden for so long without leaving a trace. Lila Hartley watched the coverage from her living room. Her hands shook as she clutched the remote. She'd waited 15 years for closure, but now, every word from Richard Cole's confession made her skin crawl. She didn't want to believe her daughter's last moments had happened just a few yards from their home. But she couldn't ignore the possibility. The thought of that garage, the same one she had seen every day out her kitchen window, made her feel sick. She drove back to Maple Hollow 2 days later, standing again at the fence line where it had all begun. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint sound of a church bell from down the road. For the first time, she didn't bring balloons. She just stood there, looking across the street at the house that had been Richard Cole's. The windows were boarded up now, the lawn overgrown. But behind those walls, she realized, might have been the last place her daughter ever breathed. Meanwhile, police continued to search for verification. They sent soil samples from the creek to the state crime lab. They subpoenaed property records, hoping to trace any changes to the land. But everything came back clean. No evidence of decomposition, no signs of disturbance. Richard's story was crumbling under the weight of its own uncertainty. Some detectives began to question whether it had ever happened at all. Terminal illness sometimes brought hallucinations, confusion, even guilt over things never done. Was this one man's delusion, or was it the first flicker of truth finally surfacing after years of silence? By the time investigators returned for a final interview, Richard was barely conscious. He drifted in and out of sleep, mumbling fragments that no one could piece together. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he kept saying. "She just wouldn't wake up." He never signed a formal statement. 2 days later, his condition worsened, and he was placed on hospice care. The doctors didn't expect him to last through the week. Outside the nursing home, a crowd of reporters had gathered. Camera lights reflected off the windows as locals watched from the sidewalk, trying to read the faces of the officers who came and went. The story that had haunted the town for more than a decade had returned, not with answers but with more questions than ever. Detective Lowell stood by her car, staring at the horizon. She had chased this case for half her life. Now, with the man she'd always suspected lying on his deathbed, she still didn't know if she'd finally found the truth, or another dead end, disguised as confession. Inside the facility, Richard Cole slept under a thin blanket, his oxygen machine humming softly. He would never see the chaos outside. He would never know that his words, true or not, had cracked open a silence that Maple Hollow had spent 15 years trying to forget. And as the night fell over the town once again, one question echoed louder than all the rest. If he was lying, why did his story fit so perfectly into the place where Lila's trail had ended? The next morning, detectives would return to that neighborhood one last time, back to the same garage that had stood untouched since 2009. And what they'd find there would change everything they thought they knew about the case. 2 days after Richard Cole's confession, detectives returned to Maple Hollow for what they believed would be their final sweep. The creek search had failed, and without physical evidence, the confession felt hollow, another story built on guilt and fading memory. But something about Cole's words kept gnawing at Detective Marianne Lowell. The way he'd described the balloon, the mention of the tarp, the shifting details about his brother, none of it fully aligned. And yet, when she looked at the old photos of the Hartley home, at the fence where the scent trail had ended, her instincts screamed that the answer was still somewhere close. So the team went back to the beginning, to the place that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The Cole property hadn't been touched in years. The house was vacant, its windows clouded with dust, the lawn overtaken by weeds. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of mildew heavy in the dark. In the garage, old stains marked the concrete floor, where Richard used to keep his workbench. It was there that detectives noticed something odd. A patch of newer cement near the back corner, slightly lighter in color, with faint circular marks as if from an old drum or bucket. According to property records, the floor had been resurfaced in 2010, less than a year after Lila disappeared. Lowell requested a ground-penetrating radar scan. It was a long shot, the kind of request that usually went nowhere after so many years. But the sheriff signed off, and within 48 hours, forensic specialists rolled in with the equipment. They dragged the antenna across the garage floor, scanning inch by inch. At first, the screen showed nothing unusual, just layers of compacted soil and concrete. Then, near the back corner, a small anomaly appeared. It was no bigger than a shoebox, but distinct. A void space where there shouldn't have been one. They ran the scan twice more. The same irregular shape appeared each time. By dawn the next morning, a team of technicians began breaking through the slab. The sound of drills and chisels echoed down the empty street, watched quietly by a few remaining neighbors who had come out, knowing something was happening again in Maple Hollow. It took nearly 4 hours to reach the cavity. When they finally did, the smell of damp soil rose through the crack. Inside the small hollow space, wrapped in what remained of a torn plastic tarp, they found a cluster of items: rusted nails, fragments of old wood, and something else. A piece of fabric. Then, just beside it, a partial shoe sole small enough to belong to a child. The excavation continued into the evening. Along with the shoe fragment, technicians recovered microscopic traces of synthetic balloon latex, the same kind used for children's party decorations. Forensics would later match the material to the brand sold locally in 2009, the kind Dana Hartley had bought for her daughter's birthday. When the results came back from the lab 2 days later, the DNA analysis confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. The small scrap of cloth contained genetic material matching Lila Hartley. The truth had never been at the creek. It had been buried under concrete less than 50 yards from the spot where the search dogs had stopped 15 years earlier. Detective Lowell stood in the garage long after the others had left. The reality of it hit her harder than she expected. She thought of Dana Hartley's voice from years before, pleading for someone to tell her where her little girl was, and realized the answer had been sitting just across the street, sealed under a layer of cement poured by the man who had pretended to help hang chairs on the morning of the party. Richard Cole never faced trial. 2 days after the discovery, he died in his sleep at the nursing home. His death certificate listed respiratory failure. The timing, investigators noted, was almost cruel in its precision. He had carried the secret for 15 years, only to let it slip days before his body gave out. When the investigation concluded, forensic analysts pieced together what had likely happened. The evidence suggested blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with Cole's original claim that Lila had fallen and struck a tool or heavy object. There were no signs of prolonged struggle or other injuries. Everything pointed toward an accident, one that might have been forgiven if he had called for help. Instead, he'd chosen deception. He'd hidden her body, built over the grave, and lived the rest of his life pretending it had never happened. Investigators later uncovered that the garage renovation had been paid for in cash, with no permits filed. Cole had told neighbors he was fixing cracks from a flood. No one questioned it. The construction crew poured the slab and left, unaware they were sealing a secret that would last more than a decade. At a press conference days later, the sheriff's tone was subdued. He didn't speak about closure or justice. He simply said, "We found Lila." The words rippled through Maple Hollow like a chill. For the first time in 15 years, there was no mystery left to solve, only grief and disbelief. Reporters crowded the cul-de-sac once again, camera lights flashing against the faded paint of the Hartley house. Some neighbors cried openly. Others stared in silence, haunted by the idea that they had lived for years just steps away from the truth. When Dana Hartley arrived that afternoon, she didn't speak to the press. She walked to the edge of the driveway, paused at the fence, and looked across at the garage. She stood there for several minutes before kneeling to the ground, her hand brushing over the grass where her daughter's trail had once ended. In that moment, there were no tears, just a quiet, hollow kind of peace. The not knowing was over. She later told a reporter that closure wasn't the right word. "It's not relief," she said, softly. "It's just knowing. Finally knowing where she was all this time." The case file was closed a month later. Officially, the Maple Hollow disappearance was ruled an accidental death with evidence of concealment. But for those who had lived through it, the detectives, the neighbors, the family, it didn't feel accidental at all. It felt like betrayal carved into concrete. Afterward, the county ordered Cole's property demolished. The slab was torn out completely, the soil beneath reburied, and sealed. In its place, the city built a small memorial garden, a single tree surrounded by a ring of flowers. No sign bore her name, but everyone who passed by knew who it was for. Detective Lowell retired for good soon after, but she kept one item from the investigation, a photograph of the backyard fence taken on that first night in 2009. In it, the grass was trampled, the searchlights blurred. She kept it pinned to her wall, not as a reminder of failure, but of how long it can take for the truth to surface. In the end, Lila Hartley hadn't vanished into the woods or been taken by a stranger on the road. She had never left the neighborhood at all. She had been there, just across the street, buried under the place where a guilty man had lived out the rest of his days. And in Maple Hollow, that knowledge became both the answer everyone had waited for and the kind of truth that no one would ever fully recover from. The summer of 2024 brought a stillness to Maple Hollow that felt almost unnatural. For the first time in 15 years, there were no more questions to ask, no more searches to organize, no more interviews to endure. Just silence and the weight of a truth that was both devastating and strangely grounding. The town decided to hold a memorial service, one final gathering to lay to rest what had haunted them for so long. On a bright Saturday afternoon, the same backyard that once overflowed with laughter and party music filled again, but this time with something heavier. The grass had grown uneven, the paint on the fence had long since peeled away, but the air carried the same faint smell of summer barbecue and honeysuckle that neighbors still remembered from 2009. A white canopy had been set up over a table lined with framed photos of Lila, her birthday portraits, school pictures, the same smiling face that had lived on posters, billboards, and news segments for over a decade. At 3 o'clock, as the crowd gathered, a gentle wind passed through the yard. Dana Hartley stood at the center, dressed simply, her eyes swollen but steady. She hadn't spoken publicly since the discovery. But when she stepped up to the small podium, the murmur of the crowd fell away. She looked out at the faces, neighbors who'd searched the woods, former detectives who'd combed the creeks, reporters who'd once staked out her lawn. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, fragile. She didn't talk about forgiveness, or anger, or what she wished could have been different. She talked about Lila, the way she used to hum while brushing her hair, the way she couldn't sleep without her stuffed rabbit, the way she once said she wanted to be a balloon lady when she grew up, filling the sky with colors. So, today, Dana said softly, we'll let her have that. Dozens of pink balloons were handed out to the crowd. Some people held them tight, reluctant to let go. Others gripped them as if afraid of dropping them too soon. On Dana's signal, the strings slipped through trembling fingers, and the sky filled with soft pink orbs rising higher and higher, until they vanished into the sun. The crowd watched in silence as they disappeared, the same way Lila had all those years ago, without a sound, without a trace, just gone. Detective Marianne Lowell stood in the back, her hands clasped, watching the sky until the last balloon was out of sight. Retirement had aged her, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She thought about the cruel simplicity of it all, how one lie, told in panic, could spiral into a lifetime of grief for an entire community. 15 years of pain, suspicion, and division, all born from a single decision made in fear. She'd spent her entire career chasing darkness, but Maple Hollow had taught her something she'd never forget. Evil doesn't always arrive with violence or malice. Sometimes it comes quietly, hidden behind a neighbor's smile and a locked garage door. After the service, Dana stayed behind when everyone else left. The backyard was quiet again, the grass trampled where people had stood. She walked toward the fence, now newly painted, the same place where Lila's trail had ended. She placed her hand on it, closed her eyes, and took a slow breath. In her other hand, she carried a small jar of soil taken from the garage where her daughter's remains were found. It wasn't much, just a handful of earth, but to her, it was sacred. She brought it home and set it on the fireplace mantel, beside a framed photo of Lila's last birthday. In the photo, Lila was caught mid-laugh, frosting on her fingers, the pink balloon tied to her wrist shining under the afternoon sun. That photo became Dana's anchor. It was the image she saw every morning and every night, the reminder of joy before the world had taken it from her. The rest of the house remained quiet, sparse. She didn't keep flowers anymore. She said they reminded her too much of funerals. but she kept the lights on in the hallway outside Lila's old room, every night, without fail. Across the street, Richard Cole's house didn't stand much longer. The county ordered it demolished within weeks of the investigation closing. The walls came down easily, the roof collapsed into splinters, and within hours, the house that had cast a shadow over the neighborhood for 15 years was reduced to rubble. The lot sat empty for months before the town council approved a small community project, a children's playground built in Lila's memory. When the construction finished, they named it Lila's Garden. The playground wasn't grand, just a few swings, a slide, a bench under a maple tree, but it was enough. Every afternoon, children's laughter returned to the same stretch of street that had once been silent for years. Parents watched from the benches, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the Hartley house, knowing the history beneath their feet. Some said it felt right. Others said it still felt strange, as if joy didn't belong there anymore. But to Dana, it was exactly what Lila would have wanted, a place where life went on. Detective Lowell visited the playground once before she moved out of state. She sat on the bench for nearly an hour, watching the swings creak in the wind. When she finally stood to leave, she whispered to herself that it was over. But in her heart, she knew that cases like Maple Hollow never really ended, they just grew quieter. For the people who lived through it, the story became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, a reminder that danger doesn't always hide in distant woods or dark alleys. Sometimes, it lives right next door, in the ordinary faces we trust. And the truth, when it finally surfaces, doesn't come from technology or breakthroughs, it comes from something human. Guilt, conscience, the unbearable weight of silence. As the sun dipped low over Maple Hollow, the new playground stood where the old house had been, its bright colors glowing under the fading light. The laughter of children echoed down the street, blending with the rustle of wind through the trees. For the first time in 15 years, the neighborhood didn't sound haunted anymore. And though the past would never truly leave them, the people of Maple Hollow could finally breathe again, because the mystery that had defined them had at last given way to truth. The balloons were gone. But somewhere, high above the town, that never stopped searching, the sky was still streaked with pink,